Mary Poppins in the Park by P.L. Travers. Chapter 5, The Park in the Park. "Another sandwich, please," said Michael, sprawling across Mary Poppins' legs as he reached for the picnic basket. It was Ellen's day out, and Mrs. Brill had gone to see her cousin's niece's new baby, so the children were having tea in the park, away by the wild corner. This was the only place in the park that was never mowed or weeded. It was never mown or weeded. Clover, daisies, buttercups, bluebells grew as high as the children's waists. Nettles and dandelions flaunted their blossoms, for they knew very well that the park keeper would never have time to root them out. None of them observed the rules. They scattered their seeds across the lawns, jostled each other for the best places, and crowded together so closely that their stems were always in shadowy darkness. Mary Poppins, in a sprigged cotton dress, sat bolt upright in a clump of bluebells. She was thinking, as she darned the socks, that pretty though the wild corner was, she knew of something prettier. If it came to a choice between, say, a bunch of clover and herself, it would not be the clover she would choose. The 4 children were scattered about her. Annabelle bounced in the perambulator, and not far off among the nettles the park keeper was making a daisy chain. Birds were piping in every bough, and the ice cream man sang cheerfully as he trundled his barrow along. The notice in front said, "The day is hot, but ice cream's not." "I wonder if he's coming here," Jane murmured to herself. She was lying face downwards in the grass, making little plasticine figures. "Where have those sandwiches gone?" cried Michael, scrabbling in the basket. "Be so kind, Michael, as to get off my legs. I am not a turkey carpet. The sandwiches have all been eaten. You have the last yourself." Mary Poppins heaved him onto the grass and took up her darning needle. Beside her, a mug of warm tea sprinkled with grass seed and nettle flowers sent up a delicious fragrance. "But Mary Poppins, I've only had 6. "That's 3 too many," she retorted. "You've eaten your share and Barbara's." "Taking the food from his sister's mouth. What next?" said the park keeper. He sniffed the air and licked his lips, just like a thirsty dog. "Nothing to beat out a cup of tea," he remarked to Mary Poppins. With dignified calm, she took up the mug. "Nothing," she answered, sipping. "Exactly what a person needs at 8 of the afternoon." He gave the teapot a wistful glance. "Exactly," she agreed serenely as she poured herself another cup. The park keeper sighed and plucked a daisy. The pot, he knew, was now empty. "Well, another sponge cake then, Mary Poppins." "The cakes are finished too, Michael. What are you, pray, a boy or a crocodile?" He would have liked to say he was a crocodile, but a glance at her face was enough to forbid it. "John," he coaxed with a crocodile smile, "would you like me to eat your crusts?" "No," said John as he gobbled them up. "Shall I help you with your biscuit, Barbara?" "No," she protested through the crumbs. Michael shook his head in reproach and turned to Annabelle. There she sat, like a queen in her carriage, clutching her little mug. The perambulator groaned loudly as she bounced up and down. It was looking more battered than ever today, for Robertson A., after doing nothing all the morning, had leaned against it to take a rest and broken the wooden handle. Oh dear," Mrs. Banks had cried. "Why couldn't he lean on something stronger? Mary Poppins, what shall we do? We can't afford a new one." "I'll take it to my cousin, ma'am. He'll make it as good as new." "Well, if you think he really can," Mrs. Banks cast a doubtful eye on the bar of splintered wood. Mary Poppins drew herself up. "A member of my family, ma'am." Her voice seemed to come from the North Pole. "Oh, indeed, yes, quite so, exactly." Mrs. Banks nervously backed away. "But why?" she silently asked herself. "Is her family so superior? She is far too vain and self-satisfied. I shall tell her so some day." But looking at that stern face and listening to those reproving sniffs, she knew she would never dare. Michael rolled over among the daisies, hungrily chewing a blade of grass. "When are you going to take the perambulator to your cousin, Mary Poppins?" "Everything comes to him who waits, all in my own good time." "Oh, well, Annabelle isn't taking a milk. Would you like me to drink it for her?" But at that moment Annabelle lifted her mug and drained the last drop. "Mary Poppins," he wailed, "I'll starve to death, just like Robinson Crusoe." "He didn't starve to death," said Jane. She was busily clearing a space in the weeds. "Well, the Swiss Family Robinson, then," said Michael. The Swiss family always had plenty to eat. But I'm not hungry, Michael. You can have my cake if you like. Dear, kind, sensible Jane, he thought as he took the cake. What are you making? He inquired, flinging himself on the grass beside her. A park for poor people, she replied. Everyone is happy there and nobody ever quarrels. She tossed aside a handful of leaves and saw, amid the wildweed, a tiny square of green. It was threaded with little pebbled paths as wide as a fingernail, and beside them were tiny flower beds made of petals masted together, a summer house of nettle twigs nested on the lawn. Flowers were stuck in the earth for trees, and in their shade stood twig benches, very neat and inviting. On one of these sat a plasticine man, no more than an inch high. His face was round, his body was round, and so were his arms and legs. The only pointed thing about him was his little turned-up nose. He was reading a plasticine newspaper, and a plasticine tool bag lay at his feet. "Who's that?" asked Michael. "He reminds me of somebody, but I can't think who it is." Jane thought for a moment. "His name is Mr. Moe," she decided. "He is resting after his morning labours. He had a wife sitting next to him, but her hat went missing, so I crumpled her up. I'll try again with the loss of the plasticine." She glanced at the shapeless coloured lump that lay beside the summer house. "And that," he pointed to a feminine figure that stood by one of the flower beds. "That's Mrs. Hickory," said Jane. "She's going to have a house, too. And that I shall build it, and after that I shall build a fun fair." He gazed at the plump little plasticine woman and admired the way her hair curled and the two large dimples in her cheeks. "Do she and Mr. Moe know each other?" "Oh, yes. They meet on the way to the lake." And she showed him a little pebbly hollow where Mary Poppins' head was turned. She had poured her mug of milk, and at the end of the lake a plasticine statue reminded Michael of Nelius. "Or down by the swing." She pointed to two upright sticks, from which an even smaller stick hung on a strand of darning wool. Michael touched the swing with his fingertip, and it swayed backward and forward. "And what sat under the buttercup?" A scrap of cardboard from the lid of the cake box had been bent to form a table. Around it stood several cardboard stools, and upon it was spread a meal so tempting that a king might have envied it. In the center stood a two-tiered cake, and around it were bowls piled high with fruit, peaches, cherries, bananas, oranges. One end of the table bore an apple pie, and the other a chicken with a pink frill. There were sausages and currant buns, and a pat of butter on a little green platter. Each place was set with a plate and a mug and a bottle of ginger wine. The buttercup tree spread over the feast. Jane had set two plasticine doves on its branches, and a bumblebee buzzed among its flowers. "Go away, greedy fly!" cried Michael as a small black shape settled on the chicken. "Oh dear, how hungry it makes me feel!" Jane gazed with pride at her handiwork. "Don't drop your crumbs on the lawn, Michael. They'll make it look untidy." "I don't see any litter baskets. All I can see is an ant in the grass." He swept his eyes round the tiny park so neat amid the wildweed. "There is never any litter," said Jane. "Mr. Moe lights the fire with his paper, and he saves his orange peel for Christmas puddings." "Oh, Michael, don't bend down so close. You're keeping the sun away." His shadow lay over the park like a cloud. "Sorry," he said, as he bent sideways, and the sunlight glinted down as Jane lifted Mr. Moe and his tool bag and set them beside the table. "Is it his dinner time?" asked Michael. "Well, no." "Well, no," said a little scratchy voice. "As a matter of fact, it's breakfast." "How clever Jane is," thought Michael admiringly. "She can not only make a little old man, she can talk like one as well." But her eyes, as he met them, were full of questions. "Did you speak, Michael, in that squeaky way?" Of course he didn't," said the voice again. And turning, they saw that Mr. Moe was waving his hat in greeting. His rosy face was wreathed in smiles, and his turned-up nose had a cheerful look. It isn't what you call the meal, it's how it tastes that matters. It isn't what you call the meal, it's how it tastes that matters. Help yourself," he cried to Michael. "A growing lad is always hungry. Take a piece of pie." "I'm having a beautiful dream," thought Michael, hurriedly helping himself. "Don't eat it, Michael, it's plasticine." "It's not, it's apple," he cried with his mouth full. "But I know, I made it myself." Jane turned to Mr. Moe. "You did?" Mr. Moe seemed very surprised. I suppose you mean you helped make it. Well, I'm very glad you did, my girl. Too many cooks make delicious broth. They spoil it, you mean, corrected Jane. Oh, no, not in my opinion. One puts one thing, one another, oatmeal, cucumber, pepper, tripe. The merrier the more, you know. The more of what? Asked Michael, staring. Everything, Mr. Moe replied. There's more of everything when one's merry. Take a peach, he turned to Jane. It matches your complexion. From sheer politeness, for she could not disappoint that smiling face, Jane took the fruit and tasted. Refreshing juice ran over her chin. The peach stone grated against her teeth. Delicious! She cried in astonishment. Of course it is, crowed Mr. Moe. As my dear wife always used to say, you can't go by the look of things, it's what's inside that matters. What happened to her? Asked Michael politely as he helped himself to an orange. He had quite forgotten, in the joy of finding more to eat, that Jane had crumbled her up. I lost her, murmured Mr. Moe. He gave his head a sorrowful shake as he popped the orange peel into his pocket. Jane felt herself blushing. Well, her hat wouldn't sit on straight, she faltered. But now it seemed to her that this was hardly a good enough reason for getting rid of the hat's owner. I know. She was always rather an awkward shape. Nothing seemed to fit her. If it wasn't her hat, it was her boots. Even so, I was fond of her. Mr. Moe heaved a heavy sigh. However, he went on gloomily, I've found another one. Another wife? Cried Jane in surprise. She knew she had not made two Mrs. Moes. But you haven't had time for that. No. Why, I've had all the time in the world. Look at those dandelions. He waved his chubby hand round the park. And I have to have someone to care for the children. Can't do everything myself. So I troubled before it troubled me and got myself married just now. This feast here is our wedding breakfast, but alas, he glanced around nervously, every silver lining has a cloud. I'm afraid I made a bad choice. Coo-roo, coo-roo, we told you so, cried the plasticine doves from their bench. Children? Said Jane with a puzzled frown. She was sure she had made no children. 3 fine boys, Mr. Moe said proudly. Surely you have heard of them. Hi, he shouted, cupping his hands. Eeny, meeny, miny, where are you? Jane and Michael stared at each other and then at Mr. Moe. Oh, of course I've heard of them, agreed Michael. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch an Indian by the toe. But I thought they were only words in a game. Mr. Moe smiled a teasing smile. Take my advice, my dear young friend, and don't do too much thinking. Bad for the appetite, bad for the brain. The more you think, the less you know, as my dear first wife used to say. But I can't spend all day chattering, much as I enjoy it. He plucked a dandelion ball and blew the seeds in the air. Goodness, yes, it's 4 o'clock, and I've got a job to do. He took from his tool bag a piece of wood and began to polish it with his apron. What kind of work do you do? Asked Michael. Can't you read? Cried the chubby man, waving toward the summer house. They turned to Jane's little shelter of twigs and saw to their surprise that it had grown larger. The sticks were solid logs of wood, and instead of the airy space between them, there were now white walls and curtained windows. Above them rose a new thatched roof, and a sturdy chimney puffed forth smoke. The entrance was closed by a red front door bearing a white placard. S. Moe, it said, builder and carpenter. But I didn't build the house like that. Who altered it? Jane demanded. I did, of course, Mr. Moe grinned. Couldn't live in it as it was, far too damp and draughty. What did you say? You built my house? He chuckled at the mere idea. A wisp of a lass like you, not as high as my elbow. This was really too much for Jane. It's you who are little, she protested. I made you of straw and plasticine. You're not as big as my thumb. Ha ha, that's a good one. Made me of hay while the sun shone. Is that what you're telling me? Straw indeed, laughed Mr. Moe. You're just like my children, always dreaming. And wonderful dreams they are. He gave her head a little pat, and as he did so, she realized that she was not indeed as high as his elbow. Beneath the branch of yellow blossoms, Mr. Moe towered above her. The lawns that she herself had plucked now stretched to a distant woodland, and beyond that nothing could she see. The big park had entirely disappeared, as the world outside disappears when we cross the threshold of home. She looked up. The bumblebee seemed like a moving cloud. The shimmering fly that darted past was about the size of a starling, and the ant that gave her a bright black stare was nearly as high as her ankle. What had happened? Had Mr. Moe grown taller, or was it that she herself had dwindled? It was Michael who answered the question. Jane! Jane! He cried. We're in your park! I thought it was just a tiny patch, but now it's as big as the world. But I wouldn't say that, Mr. Moe observed. It only stretches as far as the forest, but it's big enough for us. Michael turned at his words toward the woodland. It was dense and wild and mysterious, and some of the trees had giant blossoms. Daisies the size of umbrellas, he gasped. And bluebells large enough to bathe in. Yes, it's a wonderful wood, agreed Mr. Moe, eyeing the forest with a carpenter's eye. My second wife wants me to cut it down and sell it to make my fortune. But this is a park for poor people. What would I do with a fortune? My own idea, but that was before the wedding, of course, was to build a little fun fair. I thought of that too, Jane broke in, smiling. Well, happy minds think alike, you know. What do you say to a merry-go-round? A coconut shy and some swinging boats. And free to all, friends and strangers alike. Hurrah! I knew you'd agree with me. He clapped his hands excitedly, but suddenly the eager look died away from his face. Oh, it's no good planning, he went on sadly. She don't approve of fun fairs, too frivolous and no money in 'em. What a terrible mistake I've made, marrying in haste to repent at leisure. But it's no good crying over spilt milk. Mr. Moe's eyes brimmed up with tears, and Jane was just about to offer him her handkerchief when a clatter of feet sounded on the lawn, and his face suddenly brightened. Papa! Cried a trio of squeaky voices, and 3 little figures sprang over the path and flung themselves into his arms. They were all alike, as peas in a pod, and the image of their father. Papa, we caught the Indian. We caught him by the toe, Papa. He hollered, Papa, so we let him go. Quite right, my lads, smiled Mr. Moe. He'll be happier in the forest. Indians! Michael's eyes widened. Among these daisy trees. And I am going to interject in my Kentley voice because there is a word on this page that I am not going to read. It is a derogatory term for a female of the Native American persuasion, so we are going to substitute it with the word wife. He was looking for a wife, Papa, to take care of his wigwam. Well, I hope he finds one, said Mr. Moe. Oh, yes, of course there are Indians, and goodness only knows what else, quite like a jungle, you might say. We never go very far in, you know, much too dangerous, but let me introduce my sons. This is Eenie, this is Meenie, and this is Miney. 3 pairs of blue eyes twinkled, 3 pointed noses turned up to the sky, and 3 round faces grinned. And these, said Mr. Moe, turning. Then he chuckled and flung up his hands. Well, here we are, old friends already, and I don't even know your names. They told him, shaking hands with his children. Banks? Not the Banks of Cherry Tree Lane. Why, I'm doing a job for you, Mr. Moe rummaged in his tool bag. What kind of job? Demanded Michael. It's a new... Ah, there you are, Mrs. Hickory. Mr. Moe turned and waved a greeting at a dumpy little feminine figure. As a dumpy little feminine figure came hurrying toward them. 2 dimples twinkled in her cheeks, 2 rosy babies bounced in her arms, and she carried in her looped up apron a large, bulky object. But she had no children, said Jane to herself, as she stared at the 2 fat babies. We've brought you a present, Mr. Moe. Mrs. Hickory blushed and opened her apron. I found this lovely loaf on the lawn. Somebody dropped it. I expect my twins. This is Dickory and this is Doc. She explained to the astonished children, are far too young to eat fresh bread, so here it is for breakfast. That's not a loaf. It's a sponge cake crumb. I dropped it myself, said Michael, but he could not help feeling that the crumb was a good deal larger than he remembered it. Tee-hee! Mrs. Hickory giggled shyly, and her dimples went in and out. You could see she thought he was joking, and that she liked being joked with. A neighborly thought, said Mr. Moe. Let's cut it in 2 and have half each. Half a loaf's better than no bread, and in return, Mrs. Hickory, may I give you a speck of butter? Indeed you may not, said a furious voice, and the door of Mr. Moe's house burst open. Jane and Michael fell back a pace, for there stood the largest and ugliest woman they had ever seen in their lives. She seemed to be made of a series of knobs, rather like a potato. A knob of a nose, a knob of hair, knobbly hands, knobbly feet, and her mouth had only 2 teeth. She was more like a lump of clay than a human being, and Jane was reminded of the scrap of plasticine that had laid behind the summer house. A dingy pinafore covered her body, and one of her large knobbly hands she held a rolling pin. May I ask what you think you've been doing, Samuel? Giving away my butter? She stepped forward angrily and flourished the rolling pin. I thought we could spare it, my, dear. Mr. Moe quailed beneath her gaze. Not unless she pays for it. Spare, 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 and your back will go bare. Oh, no, my dear, you've got it wrong. Spare, spare, and you'll know no care. Poor people must share and share alike. That's what makes them happy. Nobody is going to share anything that belongs to Matilda Moe, or spare either if it comes to that. Last week you spared a footstool for your cousin, Mrs. Hickory, and what have you got to show for it? A lucky 3-penny piece from her coat. Tush! And you mended the table for the Travers. Well, Topsy gave me a charming smile. Mr. Moe beamed at the sweet recollection. Smiles won't fit a sack with gold, and the week before that it was Albert Wigg who wanted the ceiling raised. Well, he needed more room to bounce about in, and it gave me so much pleasure, Matilda. Pleasure? Where's the profit in that? In future you can get your pleasure by giving things to me, and you too, added Mrs. Moe, shaking her fist at the boys. Alas, alas, murmured Mr. Moe. No rose without a thorn, no joy without annoy. Eenie, shouted Mrs. Moe, get me a wedding wreath this instant. Look at me, a blushing bride, and nothing on my head. Oh, no, breathed Jane. You'll spoil my garden. But Eenie, with a look of alarm, had already darted to the flower beds and plucked a crown of flowers. Not enough, but better than nothing, Mrs. Moe grunted ungraciously as she planted the garland on her knobbly head. Coo-coo, laughed the doves in the buttercup branch. They don't suit you, ooh-hoo, ooh-hoo. Meanie, cried Mrs. Moe in a rage. Up with you quickly and catch those birds. I'll make them into a pigeon pie. But the doves merely ruffled their wings and flew away giggling. 2 birds in the bush are worth 1 in the hand, said Mr. Moe, gazing after them. I mean, he added nervously, they sing more sweetly when they're free. Don't you agree, Matilda? I never agree, snapped Mrs. Moe, and I'll have no singing here, Miney. Tell that man to be quiet. For a lusty voice was filling the air with the words of a well-known song. I'll sing you one, oh, green grow the rushes. It was the ice cream man cycling along the path. Jane and Michael had no time to wonder how he had managed to get into the little park, for Eenie, Meenie, and Miney were shouting, Papa, Papa, a penny, please. No ices, bellowed Mrs. Moe. We haven't the money to spare. Matilda, Mr. Moe entreated, there's my lucky 3-penny piece. That is for a rainy day, not for more enjoyment. Oh, it's not going to rain, I'm sure, Matilda. Of course it will rain, and anyway, it's my 3-penny piece. From today, Samuel, what's yours is mine. Get along, she yelled to the ice cream man, and don't come here making foolish noises. It's not a noise, it's a song, he retorted, and I'll sing it as much as I like. And away he wheeled, singing, I'll sing you too, as loudly as he could. Out of my sight, sighed Mrs. Moe, as the barrow disappeared among the trees. But not, alas, out of mind. Well, we mustn't grumble, boys. Out of sight,